Welcome to the fifth in the series of 7 presentations that celebrates the 150th anniversary of Parsons. Tonight, Dave Maddox and I will be talking about community. And as always, at the first of the presentations, Dave will give you an overview about what was going on in the United States during this time period and what was happening locally. Dave?
So the time period here that we're up to in basically Chapter 5 is the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview as to what's going on, like Mike said, in the United States and then in Parsons. As always, we'll talk about time frames other than this, but this is where we're at in the book. So in the United States, in 1950, the Korean War began. 1952, Dwight Eisenhower elected president. 1954, the first large-scale polio vaccinations. 1954 also, Brown versus Board of Education. Racial segregation was ruled unconstitutional. 1959, Alaska became a state. 1960, John Kennedy elected president. 1962, John Glenn became the first astronaut to orbit the Earth. 1963, a bad year, John Kennedy assassinated. 1964, Vietnam War begins. 1968, an even worse year, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinated. 1969, the moon landing with Neil Armstrong. In 1969, Woodstock took place in New York. By 1974, Richard Nixon had resigned, and by 1977, the Star Wars movie opened. And then, so that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of the United States. In Parsons, during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a real quick overview. 1957, the Katy offices were moved from Parsons. 1958, because of the Brown versus Board of Education, Douglas School was closed, and the school system was integrated in Parsons. 1961 was the Kansas Centennial celebration, and Parsons had a good-sized parade there. 1965, the last Katy passenger train. 1968 to 1976 was the urban renewal time frame. 1971, Parsons Vikings played the last game on Reese Hughes Field, the 95-yard field at what is now the middle school. 1972, Parsons Vikings football team played the first game at Marvel Park. And then in 1976, the Carnegie Library was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea. So now we're ready to start off. And the first slide that we have here is a little map of the Katy system. This is, you can see Parsons there is the junction point of the two lines. And when it was established in 1871, that was the reason it was established, because the two lines of the Katy came together at that junction point. This is I believe a little thing on the back of a ticket this map was, and a little bit about the Katy Shield. It was done by the Rand McNally Company, who at the time in the early 1870s was handling the Katy advertising literature, and they submitted several designs for the Katy, and the shield that we know today, or that they used for all the years, a version of that was accepted. On it, the palm symbolized the fact that the Katy won the race to Indian Territory, and the little ribbon that contained the corporate name symbolized that the Katy was the first railroad to enter Texas from the north. And we talk about the Katy first when we talk about community, because I like to say that the Katy was the ultimate community partner, because so much of Parsons' daily life was affected by the Katy Railroad, from economics to just everyday life. It pretty much permeated the Parsons society. Next slide.
The next slide is of the Katy Depot, what everyone refers to as the Victorian Depot, and probably the one most associated with the Katy Railroad here in Parsons, and also the inspiration for the 150th logo. The tower of the Victorian Depot is reproduced in the 150th logo. The first depot in Parsons, however, wasn't nearly as grand. In fact, it was a boxcar by the tracks and just had a single desk in it. The second one, a brick building, was built in 1871, but it soon became too small for the day-to-day operations of the railroad, and the Victorian Depot pictured was built in 1895 at a cost of $100,000. Citizens of Parsons placed a large self-winding clock in the tower, which at that time could be seen from most parts of the city, and every day at 10 o'clock, it was reset by Western Union. This depot is also what the Labette Bank at 22nd and Main was patterned after. Next slide. Here's a picture of the Katy Stores building at Christmas time, and by 1917, almost 15% of Parsons' total population worked for the Katy Railroad. The Katy was responsible for the depot and the offices, the record building, the shop and the yards, the power plant, the roundhouse, the YMCA, the Katy Hospital, the Katy Athletic Field, and the Katy Golf Course. So you can see when Dave said that the Katy was the ultimate city partner, it's very easy to draw that conclusion. Next slide. And here's the same building telling everyone Happy New Year from 1916. The Katy also sponsored athletic teams, meets and games, bands, and musical events. And as we've said before, almost everyone in Parsons was affected one way or another by the railroad through employment, through the economy, through leisure activities, through easy travel, and very important, the health care that the Katy provided through the Katy Hospital.
And if you'll notice on that, one of the neat things about that deal is the Katy Shield there that they've done in their landscaping there. That's pretty neat, and a lot of work to go to for, as we've said before, not a lot of time. You know, you put up the Happy New Year, it's probably not going to leave it up, but more in the week or so, and the same with the Christmas one. So a lot of work to go to just basically to support the community. And so this is the front page of the Parsons Sun, or a page in the Parsons Sun, the special edition in September of 1988, when the Katy and the UP merged. The City Commission unanimously decided to accept the Union Pacific offer of $1 million cash and help in starting a new industry and adding 10 jobs in exchange for the city's withdrawal of its opposition to the UP-Katy merger. 300 jobs were eliminated from Parsons. 75 railroad jobs remained in Parsons for about 5 years, and so I'm not sure what the amount of jobs that are there now with the UP, but it would be less than 75. Next slide.
Okay, we're switching from railroad to interurban now. And the Union Traction Interurban first ran in 1907 between Independence and Coffeyville, Kansas. And by 1910, it had reached Cherryvale. On December 21st, 1912, the first interurban cars containing Parsons businessmen came into Parsons. The businessmen had traveled to Cherryvale to be able to ride the first train into town, and I believe this is a photograph.
I think that's them, yeah.
Yeah, that's the businessmen posing in front of the interurban. Parsons celebrated the interurban as it would almost any other big event in town, with flag waving, prizes giving out, bands. It was a big deal when the interurban came to town. The trolley business and the interurban thrived in the teens and the early 20s. And in 1916, Nowata, Oklahoma was added to the line. So technically, using the trolley system and the interurban, you could go from Parsons all the way to Nowata. They had planned an addition into Tulsa, but that was never built. Okay, basically, when the Depression hit, the Union Traction Company emerged as a different company, the Union Electric Company, and World War II helped because of gas rationing. It gave the whole system a little bit of a boost.
And the ammunition plant. Right. A lot of people rode it there.
Right. But by 1947, it was pretty much outmoded. There's a great video available at the public library and at the museum that shows the last run of the interurban all the way from Nowata to Parsons. Someone put a color camera, a movie camera, in the front of it and did the whole run, and that's been edited. And you can see what it was like to basically ride the trolley from Nowata to Parsons in 1947 during the last run. Okay, next one. Here's the timetable of the interurban, and this timetable is from 1938, so it's a little bit later. There was a trolley leaving or arriving every hour, and it came into Parsons from the west, followed Main Street to Central, looped around a block by way of Central, Broadway, and 18th, and then headed back west on Main. It cost a penny a mile to ride the interurban at the time, and their slogan was "Ride and Save." And of course, there were special rates for different groups who were traveling. One of much beloved Parsonian once told me that in high school, she and her fellow students would ride to athletic events in Independence and Coffeyville on the trolley, much like people would take school buses now to see away, what we used to call away games. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now we're going to talk just a bit about aviation in Parsons. And as you can see from the caption there, it says, "The crowd watching for aviator C.P. Rogers," which is Cal Rogers. And this is October 14th, 1911. And this is out just to the north of the State Hospital in an open field. And you can see there's a pretty good sized crowd there. Cal Rogers was expected in Parsons. And this is basically the first time many Parsonians would see an airplane. He was attempting to win the Hearst Prize, which was a $50,000 prize offered by William Randolph Hearst for the first cross-continent flight. And that's not cross-continent, get in the plane and fly all the way across the continent. That's just getting there. So he was flying basically what you could drive a car today. He was flying a little bit every day, but it was a $50,000 prize for doing that. And so that's what he was trying to do. On the day he was supposed to come to Parsons, he was expected to come from Overland Park, and he was basically flying low enough that he was using the Katy Railroad tracks to guide himself. And he was expected to land just north of the asylum or the State Hospital, as we said. He was supposed to circle the city several times and then land and then stay on the ground for about an hour. And there was a huge interest in Parsons. The Parsons Sun had 2 phone lines that were busy most of the day answering questions. They had more than 1,000 phone calls. The superintendent of schools had contacted the Sun and said that they would let kids out to see the, as they called him, the Birdman. Streetcars were running to just south of the landing area, and following Cal Rogers was a special train with 25 people on it, including his wife. Usually they were quite a bit behind him, but they would come and arrive after he did. And the Sun talked about Cal Rogers as a man of great physical strength and endurance. He was large-boned, and they called him a giant in height. He was 6'4", which is, I think is funny that they called him a giant, because I don't feel like I'm a giant, and that's my height. But according to the Parsons Sun, also a less nice thing to say, that they said he was a man without humor or imagination, which I found to be kind of funny. He smoked 25 to 30 cigars in an 8 to 10 hour day, or 8 to 10 hours. So he smoked about 3 cigars an hour. So that's quite a bit. If you want to go to the next slide, then you can see that, as many things in history, the best laid plans, Cal Rogers didn't stop in Parsons. He said because of a storm, he didn't want to stop. The Parsons Sun estimated there were 10,000 people that waited all afternoon to see him land, and they did see him fly over, but he didn't circle and he didn't land. Rumors at the time were that other towns had sweetened the pot and he passed over Parsons. As I said, he always claimed that it was a storm and he couldn't take the chance on it. Just for your information, he did become the first person to make the cross-continent flight. He didn't make it in the deadline, so he didn't win the $50,000, but he was the first person to fly across the continent. And it was in a plane that he had purchased from the Wright brothers. And this happened only 8 years after Orville Wright's famous first flight. So 8 years after the Wright brothers flew for the first time, Cal Rogers flew across the continent. And also, just a little information, this was 1911 that this happened, that he was supposed to be in Parsons and he ended up flying over. In 1912, he was killed when he crashed his plane into the surf in Long Beach, California. So,
and I might add on that basically reports indicate that he ran into a flock of birds, and his death is the first recorded bird strike by someone in a plane.
And we thought it was kind of a strange coincidence that he had been referred to as the Birdman by the Parsons Sun. Next one.
Okay, we're also just talking a little bit about what makes up the community in terms of activities that people would have attended at the time. And here's a perfect example of the Golden Eagle Flying Circus. The first city airport in Parsons was built in 1927, and it took $325 to construct a 100-foot circle made of concrete in the field and clearly visible from the sky with 10-foot letters in the center of this circle. It said Parsons. So if you were flying over, you could see it, just like some cities still have their name in big rocks on the side of a hill or something.
That seemed to be all it took to have an airport then, was a grass field and a big circle that said the name of your town so that they could see it from the air.
Right. That field was called Ryan Airport, named after Claude Ryan, the person who basically built the Spirit of St. Louis for Charles Lindbergh. It was 2 miles east of Parsons on the north side of Main Street. One business owner in town who owned a department store actually had the word Parsons painted on the rooftop of his building so people flying over would know where they were. But here's an example, as I said, of an entertainment that has to do with the airplanes. The Golden Eagle Flying Circus. Admission was 25 cents. There was wing walking, ladder rope stunts, loop-the-loop, and also you could take a ride on the airplane for $2.50. Next slide.
So by the 1940s, about 1940, the city decided they needed more space for the airport. So they purchased 60 acres of land at the northwest corner of 32nd and Main in September 1939. So it's going to be about, if you know where the gun range is now, that's about where it is. And I talked to somebody today who told me they thought one of the old hangars was still standing out there that's being used for storage, but it's still there. Again, it had a grass runway. There wasn't a concrete or anything like that. The city paid $40 an acre for their 60 acres of land. So they paid $2,400 for the Glenn McConnell, a local guy that had an airplane, bought the remaining 20 acres, and he built a hangar on there. At the time, Mr. McConnell was the only plane owner in Parsons, and he became the manager of that airport in the early 40s. By the late 1950s, the city was interested in moving the airport to the old government surplus airfield 13 miles west of Parsons, and that did come to happen. The Tri-City Airport was dedicated August 12, 1961. They built a new administration building and other facilities that represented an investment of more than $1 million there. And they had concrete or paved runways as opposed to the grass runways. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about a couple of churches. There's so many churches. We've just picked a couple of them out, and we picked these out because they don't get talked about that much. So this is the 85th anniversary program of the New Hope Baptist Church. This church was formed in April 29th, 1876, when 13 people met at John Robinson's hay barn in the 1800 block of Washington Avenue, and they organized the church. In the summer of 1876, the first frame structure was erected at 21st and Grand, and that frame building was used until 1893. It was about 20-foot by 32-foot building. Wasn't very big. In 1893, brick building was built at a cost of about $3,000, and baptisms there, I found advertisements saying the baptisms were held at the bridge across Lebec Creek east of town. And this church has been one of the centers of the black community in Parsons for 145 years, and the church is still there in the same location. So, next slide. And then this is the Brown ChapelAME Church, and it was organized in 1874. The original structure, again, was a one-room frame building on the corner of 18th and Washington. In 1891, a brick building was constructed on that same location at a cost of $3,000. But by 1917, more room was needed, and so a new brick building, which is this one, was constructed at the same location, and its cost was $25,000. And one of the interesting things about that, as I said, it was built in 1917. The Reverend Green was the pastor there then. He declared there would be no dedication until the building was completely paid for. And so on July 24th, 1942, the church was finally dedicated after they burned the mortgage. So it took 25 years to get it paid off, and they finally had the dedication. Unfortunately, it was torn down in October of 1973 in urban renewal. They did build a new building in October 1974 at 2107 Briggs. And again, this has been a big part of the black community for 140 plus years. So, next slide.
Here's a picture of St. Pat's, and this is at their flagpole dedication. This dedication took place on Armistice Day in 1930. I believe the same year that they had the dedication for the Doughboy statue on the municipal building lawn. Even after the construction of the new St. Pat's School in 1951, the flagpole remained. The first school was started in 1881 by the Sisters of Loretto and was called Sacred Heart Academy. It was located at 1830 Durr, and that was kindergarten through 8th grade, and that was behind the present church. An 1881 Parsons Sun article indicates, and this is a quote from the Sun, "The Catholic school will be opening in about 2 weeks. The manager desired us to state that the rumor that the school would be opened with a dance is untrue, as nothing of the kind was ever thought of." So no dancing at the opening of St. Pat's. The new school was built in 1913 at 1825 Stevens, and St. Mary's School on the west side was opened in 1913 as well. And I think there may be another slide.
This is the one.
Oh.
I think the previous one.
Oh,
the one you
okay,
want,
got it. Okay. Well, in 1950, St. Patrick's School.
You want to go back a slide?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
There you go.
Yes. On September 8, 1950, St. Pat's School, the new building opened with 252 students, and that was the largest enrollment ever. It was K through 10th grade and 11th through 12th in the next 2 years. And that building cost $225,000. And as I said, the major dedication was in 1950. It was a completely fireproof construction, and the only wood used in the entire building was the gymnasium floor. And the bleachers at the time would accommodate 700 people. Next slide, yeah. St. Patrick School were called their mascot were the leprechauns, and sometimes the Parsons Sun, I believe, called them the Pixies, although I don't think that was an official name. But there was a high school there from 1952 till 1971, and after 1971, students transferred to PHS. The grade school would continue to operate and does so to this day. The yearbook for the school was called the Lorica, and Lorica is the best breastplate of St. Patrick. And that was a little bit of trivia. I didn't know.
I never knew what the Lorica. I knew that was the name of their yearbook every year, but I never knew what that was till I read that newspaper article.
And I believe this photograph is of the last day of high school at St. Pat's.
Yep. Next slide. So here we're going to talk just a bit about the why in the Hispanic community in Parsons, because that's been a big part of Parsons as well. This is Francisco and Rosa Romero. Francisco Romero came to Parsons in 1918 and got a job at the rail station with the luggage department when he was 20 years old. He married Rosa Ramirez Yanez in that same year. And the family home was at 2011 Felix, which is in the Y. It's a dead-end street next to the Katy tracks. And basically we're showing them because from what I can gather, in the 30s and 40s, this couple was the center of activity in the Mexican community. They organized dances, celebrations, fiestas for many years. And the first at a building on their property, they let everyone use it as a community center, and later at a community building called the Guadalupe Hall, and it was at 21st and Felix, not very far away. But they were instrumental in getting that open for the Mexican community. Unfortunately, they both died in a car wreck in 1948, and it really left a big hole in the Mexican community, losing those two. This is one of the parades that would have been organized by the couple, and basically this is a parade celebrating the Mexican independence. Like I said, they would have fiestas and parades and things. A queen and her attendants were selected, and that's what this is. So, next one. And this is an advertisement for one of their fiestas. And again, it was originally held in a building behind the Romero home at 2011 Felix. And then the Guadalupe Hall was constructed in 1947 at 21st and Felix, which is where this one would have been at. And according to people I've talked to, that basically is between the old tennis courts that are now being used as storage, and a house just to the north would have been where the Guadalupe Hall was. And Tony Munoz had told me that he didn't remember the building, but for many years there was still a platform and a stage, remnants of the building that were there, and then they were torn down. Later on, there was a building used as a community hall that originally was what was known as the GI Forum building, and it was at 21st and Fellows. And from 1958 to 1963, as I said, the GI Forum was a national organization, a veterans organization for Mexican Americans, and they tried to help with establish equal rights for Mexican Americans. At its peak, there were 30 members locally. And so later on, the GI Forum building in 1966 was used by the Parsons Recreation Commission as a north branch of the Recreation Center. And as I said, it was in the old GI Forum building. So next slide. And then this is Our Lady of Victory Church. It was located at the southwest corner of Central and Chess, and it was built for the Mexican community. Opened in 1940. It was a church on the main floor, and then it had a school for grades 1 through 8, or at least that's what I understand. Grades 1 through 8 were in the basement. And there is a few people that are still alive that went to school there. Tony Munoz also told me that Juanita Yanez is one of the few living people that actually went to school there at Our Lady of Victory. The school closed in 1950. The church closed in 1951. And the building was used for various purposes. After that, it was used by the Boy Scouts for meetings. It was used for band practices. And then Tony had told me that in the late 60s, it was actually used as a residence for the St. Patrick Church janitor for a while. Torn down in the late 60s, early 70s. I haven't been able to determine the exact date, but next slide. So I'm going to talk a bit about Douglas School and some about the black community. This is a photo of Douglas School. It opened in September of 1908 at 812 South Central. It was a grade school and later added a junior high at a cost of $18,000. It was a 2-story brick building. And it was for black students only. Many in the black community were not overly happy that their children had to go to Douglas School and not a school that was closer to their residence. There was actually a lawsuit filed against the school board by a Parsons resident that went to the Kansas Supreme Court in 1910, challenging that they didn't want their kids to have to go across town or farther than they should have to, but did not win the lawsuit. So formal opening at Douglas School was September 28th, 1908. Later, the school became a fixture in the black community and somewhat a source of pride there. Many events, athletic and social, took place there through the years. And as we said in the introduction, in 1958, after the Brown versus Board of Education case, Douglas School was closed and the students there were integrated into the other schools in town. The building was torn down in 1962-63. And so this is a photograph of the Douglas faculty in 1941. And one person we wanted to point out is in this photograph. He's right in the center in the back row, is Levi Watkins. Watkins came to Parsons in 1940 from Tennessee, where he had earned a master's degree from Northwestern University. He was later president of a couple colleges and ended his career as president of Alabama State. He was only a Parsons resident from 1940 to 1948 before he moved back to the South, but he made a huge impact on the community. As I said, he was principal of Douglas School from 1940 to 48. He founded the Parsons Community Service Fund in 1941, and this funded 12 organizations serving over 500 youth and 80 adults in the black community. He also compiled the first and only city directory of black residents and organizations in 1947, which showed an alphabetic listing of names of the residents, addresses, phone numbers, religions, and spouses and children. And he was also instrumental in opening the Civic Center at 24th and Morgan in 1948. There we go. And as I said, it was completed in August of 1948, used for activities, meetings, scouting, any activity, and he always advertised that it was open for people to use without regard for race or creed. He was kind of a man ahead of his time, I think. The building was purchased from the War Assets Administration, and it was moved from Independence Army Airport in sections to the PCSF, which is the Parsons Community Service Fund, lots at 24th and Morgan. And if you drive by 24th and Morgan, there's still a swing set and a basketball court there, which is the remnants of the Civic Center. So anyway, that playground apparatus had been installed earlier on that lot before the building was there. So that building is, or the playground equipment has been there for a long time. Next slide.
Here's a picture of Parsons Sun workers. The Sun has been a part of the community for as long as there has been a community here. The Parsons Sun was founded in 1871, and this photo shows workers at the Sun building, which was 219 South Central at that time in 1923, heading to a company, what we would call today a company picnic. There were other newspapers in Parsons, however, other than the Sun, although none of them were as long-lasting as the Parsons Sun. I can just name several for you. There was the Arbitrator, the Blade Democrat, the Daily Eclipse, the Daily Evening Star, the Daily Outlook, the Evening Herald, the Daily Republican, the Daily Sun, the Parsons Independent, the Parsons Palladium, the Parsons Surprise, that one always intrigues me, the Parsons Weekly Blade, the Parsons Eclipse, the Parsons Globe, the Parsons Herald, the Parsons Star, the Railroad Employee, the Parsons News, and Farm Talk. And that's not all on the list. So there were a lot of newspapers in Parsons, but the one that has lasted as long as the city has been here is the Parsons Sun.
We're going to talk again a little bit about another community member, KLKC. I don't think anyone could imagine the community of Parsons without KLKC. And this is the Parsons Sun newspaper on the day that they went on the air in 1948. And a lot of the information that I have on the early days of KLKC were taken from a diary that was kept by the first general manager of KLKC. His name was Perm Trimble, and his daughter came in my store several months ago and said she had this diary that she had transcribed, and he was, like I said, the first general manager, and asked if I would want her to send it to me, and I said, yeah, because I knew we were doing this deal on community. So a lot of these comments and a lot of the things, the insight that we got from this came from that. Trimble was basically everything at the Parsons, or at the KLKC when it first started. He was a salesman, he was a broadcaster, he was public relations, he was a marketing man, he was the HR person, he was the construction supervisor, and also the general manager. He, in his diary, said that the first advertising that he sold on KLKC was to Joe Bartelli for Sally Ann Bakery, and he agreed to sponsor a half-hour request show. Between his work at all his station jobs, it seems like from reading his diary that he had to have spoke before every group and organization in Parsons. It seemed like he did that every night. And just an example of, and he always had little witty comments, and one of, after speaking to the Ministerial Alliance, he said that he had never seen preachers eat so many eggs. So just little, he would usually only have like a little one-sentence thing after each one. But in the early days, it seemed like most of his writing before the KLKC got in the air, after he became employed and before they actually went on the air, was waiting for the construction permit from the federal government, because you had to get permission from the federal government to do this, to open a radio station. And basically he was employed from February until August, until he finally got his construction permit in August. This is the photo at the right-hand side of the Fay Hotel, which is where KLKC leased their first studio at 1904 Broadway. And so this was their first studio. They finally got it built in 1948. And just another example of one of his things on selling local business accounts. He commented about one local business owner: "Such a flighty woman, round and round she goes mentally, and where she stops nobody knows. I know I don't." So another comment that he had: "Talk to the dear ladies of the PTA and then nuts." So financially, the station, from his writing, it is not doing well. He has a hard time finding announcers, so he has to fill in whenever there's an open spot. And there were, at that time, was a lot of live show announcing and programming. They would, as an example of that, they had an hour-long radio show in honor of the retirement of Charles McRae, Parsons' musical director at the high school college. And they had, just to give you an example of what was happening at this hour-long radio show, and this would have been live, they had singing, strings, ensembles, trio, a quartet, and 2 soloists. And he then comments, "It was a grand success." So it would be a lot different than now, where you play records or play CDs or whatever you play now, to have to set up something to do a live, basically a live program. By November 1949, another comment in his diary, he had to write "payroll today, very overdrawn," which a lot of people can relate to that. By December 31st, 1949, you could tell things were really not going well. The station hasn't progressed as it should have due to the attitudes of small-town Parsons merchants, few of them having much sense. And then this is the open house advertisement. More comments from him. January, did the usual 2 newscasts, which as usual ruined my holiday. Also in January, station at a low ebb, see no future for any of us if we remain. By February, station conditions are very bad. By March, had to reduce staff. But there was some rare good news in March of 1949. KLKC did broadcast their first Major League Baseball game, so a rare bit of good news there. By August, it says usual week starts with KLKC bank account well overdrawn. And by September, as you can tell, September 1950, he was resigning from KLKC. So you can say a lot of difficulties in the early days for KLKC, but even with all the difficulties, they have survived now more than 70 years. I want to go to the next one. And then we'll talk just a bit about a couple of the people that were instrumental in KLKC's success. This is Gene Joslin, one of KLKC's first broadcasters in 1948, and this is a 1948 picture. He began the station's first record show, Top of the Morning, from the top of the dial, right after the manager, Kerm Trimble, gave the morning's opening to listeners. Community Broadcasting Company bought the station in 1954, and the station moved to the upstairs of what is now Great Southern Bank, which is probably where more people remember it from. In 1955, Joslin and Dick Combs became managers of KLKC and bought an interest in the station. In 1978, KLKC FM was added, and new studios east of town were built in the mid-1980s. In 2004, the station was purchased by Acme Broadcasting, and then in 2005, Skill purchased the KLKC from Acme. And then in 2015, the Parsons Media Group, the present owners, purchased the station from Skill. So if we want to go to the next slide. As I said at the presentation, I will always think, when I think of KLKC, I will always think of Gary Cantrell and Steve Lardy. And this is a picture of Gary. Like I said, for most of us over 40, you can't really think of KLKC without mentioning him. He moved to Parsons in 1979 to work at KLKC. And again, he was kind of like Kerm Trimble. I think he held almost every position there at one time or another. I know he was an announcer, a salesman, the station manager, and general manager. And he cut commercials, did whatever it took to keep KLKC going. He remained at KLKC for 25 years, and along with announcer and sportsman Steve Lardy, is always what I think of when I think of KLKC.
Okay. We're going back a bit now. Here's a picture of the Parsons Fire Department in 1897. The early fire department in town was entirely volunteer, and members did receive some benefits in the sense that they were exempt from jury duty or from poll taxes.
Not really a great benefit.
But well, hey, it's something. But by 1885, the department had a 2-hose and a 1-hook and ladder company, and they were relatively effective in the community. It was that year noted in the city directory that the boys, meaning the fire department, should receive something substantial from the citizens as an encouragement. And this photo shows the original police fire building and the hose tower at 1805 Broadway. This is the present-day mustard seed and gift shop, and this was built in 1893. By 1902, the volunteer firemen were dropped. The concept of being a volunteer was dropped in favor of a paid force. Okay, next slide. Here's the new fire and police building that was constructed and opened in 1936, I believe.
No, this is the earlier one. It's confusing because they're built in the same place and they look almost the same, but this is the earlier one.
And so here's the earlier one, and then there was one built in 1936, which was a WPA project. And at the opening in 1936...
You want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, I think there's another slide. Yeah, there's the WPA project building being constructed. As I said, opened in 1936. The Katy Municipal Band played at the opening. There was a fireman show where they showed ladder climbing and fire hose displays, and there was an open house to inspect the new building.
And the Parsons Sun article said that basically the ladder climbing and the shooting the hose was supposed to be attractive to the little boys in the crowd, but they thought the fathers enjoyed it more than the little kids did.
Which probably is
Probably.
Okay, this is the Parsons Recreation Committee building in the 1960s. It was the Bell Telephone building. Actually, today I talked to a lady who worked as a telephone operator in that building. And she was telling me some good stories about the building. But the PRC in 1956, or 1957, this was the Parsons Recreation Center, and it was remodeled and at 1625 Main and opened there. But in 1961, a fund drive was held to raise $28,000 to purchase this building at 1711 Belmont for use as the recreation center. So very briefly, there was a rec center at 1625 Main, then it moved to 1711 Belmont. By 1961, the building had been purchased for $23,000 and the remodeling was completed. There was an open house on September 29th and 30th, 1961, and the original building at 1625 Main was cleared during urban renewal.
As was this building.
Yes, yes. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's a Parsons Recreation Commission advertisement from 1964, and Carol Cobble was Recreation Director at that time. Activities, as you can see from this advertisement, include summer art, a tot lot, a senior citizens club, youth choir, summer stock theater, youth dances, tennis, ceramics, weightlifting, golf, BB gun, target shooting, a wide variety of activities held there. The 1711 Broadway building was also raised during urban renewal, as Dave said. Okay, next slide. Here's a slide for an advertisement from 1976 when the Recreation Committee had an open house for their new building. They gave the guided tours of the new facility at 2000 Heacock, and the open house was June 10th, 1976. Arvon Phillips, whom the facility is now named after, was the director, and the new facility in 1976 cost $600,000. Next one. Okay, now we're ready to talk about urban renewal, which is sometimes everyone's favorite controversial topic.
But it was part of the community. It's been part of the community, so we have to talk about it.
Yeah, so we're talking about it. One way or the other, basically. Okay, here's an issue of the Parsons Sun from September 14th, 1968. It says, "There is a new era for Parsons through urban renewal." Clyde Reed Jr. was chairman of the Urban Renewal Board, and the cost of urban renewal was $15 million. The city's share, $3,750,000.
And this was an artist rendition that's on here where they've pasted in some actual buildings. And then one of the interesting things people commented on at the presentation was that there's a vacant lot there where the Carnegie Library or the Carnegie Art Center is now, because originally that was scheduled to be taken out during urban renewal, but you know more about that than I do.
And it was saved by a group of individuals who worked with the city to save that. Another thing that's not here now that was on the artist's conception if you can go back to that slide there, is there's not a walking bridge across Main Street.
A second story, yeah.
Building across,
right.
And there's not a swimming pool east of the Parsonian.
Right.
So there's lots of things that didn't really happen, although the European-styled pedestrian mall with its serpentine walls and fountains and futuristic gazebo were constructed, as most people recognize. Okay, next one. Here's a picture of building the plaza. Urban Renewal required 270 parcels of real estate. They acquired that real estate, and 243 structures were torn down in a 35-square block area. This photo shows the concrete canopies going up, and the gazebo at 18th and Main is in mid-construction. You can see the first of the soaring tripod supports, I suppose you would say, being constructed there. Okay, next slide. Here's a photograph of the plaza very much later, after it had been there quite a few years. The plaza itself cost $750,000 and was dedicated in November of 1971 by the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, George Romney. This photo was taken in the late 1990s, and the plaza was 20 years old and was beginning to show its wear and decay. The fountains were no longer working. If I remember correctly, the water fountains and the telephones that were on the supports of the canopies were no longer functional, and it was just looking a little shop-worn at that time. I told the story at the presentation that during that time there was always someone commenting on whether they should take the plaza out or fix it back up, even after they replaced the sagging canopies once. Should it be torn down? Should it not be torn down? And I remarked to someone one time, it would take an act of God to get something to happen. And surprise, it did take an act of God to get something to happen. The tornado in April of 2000 damaged the concrete canopies, and it forced the decision to remove the plaza or spend millions of dollars to repair it. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is where the restoration of Main Street is taking place, and that heralded a revitalization of Main Street. The cost to remove the plaza and redo Main Street was $3.7 million. And if I believe, and if I'm speaking correctly, I think a lot of it came in as money from the tornado damage federal funds coming in. The city received a grant for $2.1 million of that $3.7 million. And Parsons later became an official Main Street city, and Main Street reopened on Black Friday of 2002.
You need to at least tell your story of...
Oh, okay. I kept watching to see if when Main Street was going to open. That's before I lived on Main Street. And one day I was driving down Main, and all of a sudden there were city workers there pulling away the barricades for Main Street, and I was right there, so I made a quick turn. And unless I'm incorrect, I was the first person to drive down the new Main Street just by chance.
And coincidentally, we opened our store that same day, and I remember the first car going down Main Street. Didn't know it was Mike at the time, but I thought it's coincidental that would happen, that he would be the first person to drive down. And I saw the first car go down Main Street.
Yeah, if I'd known you then, I would have waved,
you
Dave.
could have honked and waved. It would have been great.
Yeah, okay. Next slide. We're going to end the revitalization of Maine by showing this 2013 photograph, showing Maine basically as it is today, right after a storm. and it had been almost 20 years since the canopies in the plaza were removed. But we like to think that that was a good thing, and Main Street is alive and well today. And we'd like to end this presentation with this great picture of Main Street and a rainbow.
Yep, yep. And it's been, like you said, it's been, you know, the plaza was there around 20 years or so, and now we're 20 years into having Main Street back. So.
So thank you for watching this presentation, and there will be 2 more down the line before we conclude Parsons 150 celebration. Thank you very much.